All right. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and thank you for everyone listening in wherever you are in the world. It's a pity we couldn't do this in person, but c'est la vie. So today I'm going to be talking about convergent evolution in tooth-wheel cochleae. But before I go into sort of speaking in detail about tooth-wheels, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the evolution of whales and dolphins as a whole, and sort of how their hearing abilities differ from each other, and also from terrestrial mammals as well, before actually going into the convergent evolution part specifically. So, I can just get this working, that would be good. There we are. So whales and dolphins, as the group itself is actually known as Cetacea, and now I might be biased in saying this, but I think they are the exemplar group if you're wanting to study macroevolutionary patterns and patterns of morphological change over deep time. And the reason why this is that the fossil record of the group is it's relatively very good compared to most other, not just mammal groups, but most other animal groups more generally. So we have all these wonderful, essentially, I guess, transitional stages in their evolution, going from the earliest known cetaceans, and that's something like this animal here at the bottom of the slide, Pachycetus. And this was around about 50 million years ago. And as you can see, it's clearly very different from a dolphin or the blue whale that's swimming around in the water today. So these animals have underwent a large amount of change, and it's happened, at least in geological terms, it's happened relatively rapidly. So you have something like Pachycetus at the bottom there, and in the space of about 10 or 15 million years, they've become fully adapted for aquatic life, and that's entailed wholesale reorganization of pretty much every aspect of their biology. And that just includes, examples like the tail becoming much more muscular, and the appearance of a tail fluke, the hind limbs gradually becoming reduced and then essentially completely lost their vestigial in modern species. And then things like the movement of the nostrils from the tip of the snout right up to the top of the head. And we can track that right across the fossils. It happens, it's a really nice transitional series, but again, happened relatively rapidly, at least in geological terms. In terms of the animals that are swimming around in our oceans and rivers today, there's two main groups. You have the baleen whales, or the mysticetes, and these are things like the blue whale, humpback whale, so the ocean giants essentially. And then you also have the toothed whales, which of course is what we're interested in today, and that's sort of things like dolphins, orcas, sperm whales, beaked whales, and so on and so forth. So before we do focus on the toothed whales themselves, just a little bit of background about sort of baleen whale hearing, and it actually ties in quite nicely with one of the questions Anne was asked a few moments ago. So you were talking about elephant and low frequency hearing. Well, these animals also have low frequency hearing, and probably some similar sort of drivers there too. But in terms of how much research has been done on baleen whale hearing, there's been a lot less, and that's primarily due to one reason, and that is they are absolutely huge. The sheer size of these animals just makes the logistics of even, like, for example, this blue whale skull here that I'm standing beside, even just if you want to measure the length of that, you need to get a really big ladder. So just even simple, basic morphometric measurements become all of a sudden a lot more complicated. And you can't put animals like this in a tank and observe them. And even when you're in the wild, if they decide to dive deep for a while or swim off fast, it's very difficult indeed to try and study them in any sort of meaningful way. Having said that, we do know a little bit about their hearing, and this is where it ties in with the previous discussion about the elephant low frequency hearing. We do know that baleen whales have adaptations for low frequency hearing, and these include large, sort of massive ear ossicles, which will transfer low frequency sounds preferentially to high frequency sounds. And then the cochlea itself will have adaptations for low frequency hearing as well. And these are things like so just the number of turns that the cochlea completes to the actual length of the cochlea. And of course, as Steve was mentioned before there, sort of the stiffness of that basilar membrane is actually a lot less stiff than what you would see in something adapted for hearing high frequency sounds as well. And in terms of the animal kingdom, we believe that baleen whales are record breakers. They have been recorded producing vocalizations as low as 12 hertz. So this is well below that 20 hertz limit, or approximate limit of what humans can hear. So these are producing and almost certainly detecting infrasonic sounds as well. Moving on to toothed whales then. So, baleen whales occupy one sort of end of the spectrum in terms of what sounds they can hear in the sort of low frequency end, whereas Odontocetes are very much specialized for the other end of the spectrum, and that's for high frequency ultrasonic sounds you can hear. The group itself is the most successful marine mammal lineage, and there's around 80 species alive today, but we are finding more and more pretty much every year, which might be surprising given the size of these animals, but we continue to find new species, whether that's through cryptic diversity or just completely new species that we didn't realize were there. There's even some species that we have a skull of, that a stranded specimen is washed up, and we have them in a museum collection, but we've actually never seen alive in the wild, yet we know they are a separate species. So the diversity of these animals is still increasing. They're found all around the world in every major ocean basin, as well as several independent invasions of river systems. So you think of things like the Ganges river dolphin, the Amazon river dolphin, and unfortunately the recently extinct Yangtze river dolphin, the Baji, as well. And what we believe to be the catalyst for this sort of evolutionary success, this high number of species diversity, is their ability to echolocate. And echolocation, of course, is much like bats use. It's a biological sonar that they can use to navigate in essentially where there is no light for them to actually see. Just to give you a very, very brief sort of rundown of how something like a dolphin here, this schematic of a dolphin, might actually echolocate. So they will take in air at the top of their head through the blowhole, and most of that air will of course go into the lungs for them to breathe, but some of it will be stored in these little air sacs just below the blowhole, these little offshoots of the nasal passage. Some air will be stored in there until they actually want to produce a sound for echolocation, or whether it's some clicks or whistles for more communication purposes. But they will store some air in there. And then when they want to make a sound, they will force air through these phonic lips, which are in the nasal passage. And these fleshy lips are held very, very tightly together. So when the air is actually forced through there, it produces this really high-pitched, high-frequency sound. And it's the same principle. If you were to sort of purse your lips together really tightly and trying to force air out of your mouth, you would make that sort of funny noise. It's exactly the same principle there. So once that happens, the sound travels into the animal's forehead, where we have this specialized fat deposit known as a melon. And this is actually what gives toothed whales their sort of characteristic bulbous foreheads. If you look at the outline of the skull, it's actually quite concave, but there's this massive fat deposit sitting in the forehead known as the melon. And what this does is actually, essentially, it acts as an acoustic lens and focuses or disperses the sound as necessary before it leaves the animal and enters the surrounding environment. So the sound will go through the melon and then out into the water, and it will travel through the water until it strikes, say, for example, a prey item, like this incredibly anatomically accurate fish here on the right. And then the sound itself will then be reflected back from the prey item back to the animal, where it will then be detected. Now, if this was you or me or any other terrestrial mammal, this reflected sound would enter, or at least re-enter, our auditory pathway via the external ear canal. The sound will travel down the canal, reach the eardrum. The vibrations of the eardrum would, of course, make the middle ear bones vibrate, and those vibrations would be then passed up into the cochlea. In dolphins and other toothed whales, of course, this is actually quite different. The sound actually re-enters the auditory pathway via a secondary specialized fat deposit, this time located at the rear of the mandible. So this mandibular fat pad is again made up of these specialized acoustic fats that actually provide a preferential pathway to the ear bones at the base of the skull, where this fat pad actually contacts, and then the vibrations will then travel up into the ear bones and reach the cochlea more or less the same way as in terrestrial mammals. And it's this endpoint of the auditory pathway that most of my research is concerned with in terms of marine mammal hearing, and it's of course the cochlea. And there's a couple of reasons for this. It's first of all, it's the shape of it. Our previous studies have shown there's correlations between the shape of the cochlea and what actual sounds animals can hear, and also potential correlations with what habitats these animals are living in. And for me, as a paleontologist, this is great because not only can we sort of find this out about living animals, we can look at the ear bones of fossil animals and then extend these hypotheses, these correlations, into deep time, and actually find out about the evolution of their hearing abilities, about the evolution of echolocation, and potentially what habitat these animals were swimming around in. And secondly, the ear bones of cetaceans are incredibly dense. So the periodic, or for terrestrial mammals, the petrosal, where the cochlea is housed, this bone is incredibly dense in cetaceans, and then preserves very well in the fossil record. So this is one of the most common bones we actually have for fossil cetaceans, and then we can actually get this really great insight into their with the cochlea as a proxy for it. So thinking along these lines, myself and my co-authors, we thought, well, if there are potential correlations with habitat and things like that, well, maybe can we actually quantify the shape of the cochlea and test whether or not there's actually been convergent evolution that's taking place in one or more lineages of toothed whales, and that's exactly what we've done in this study. So first of all, we need to gather, of course, the sample of ear bones, and we did that using this particular study just focused on living species of toothed whales, and we used the collections here at the Natural History Museum in London for that. And we got nearly every living genus recorded. But we have since built on this data set. We now have lots of baleen whales and also lots of fossil cetaceans as well. So probably I would say we have the largest sample of cetacean inner ear models probably in the world, and we're looking to sort of continue building on that data set as well. And it's, of course, if people are wanting to play around with that, we're happy to share and collaborate with that as well. In terms of actually quantifying the shape of the inner ear, we used a technique known as geometric morphometrics. A lot of you are probably very well familiar with the approach, but for those of you that are not, this is just basically a way that you can quantify the shape of an object. It doesn't have to be a cochlea. It could, of course, be a skull or a limb bone or whatever it is you're interested in. And you can quantify the shape of these objects, remove any confounding factors like size or scale or rotation, and then extract the sort of the major axes of variation from the shape of these structures and compare them in a sort of rigorous and repeatable manner. So that's what we did. We then took the results of that shape quantification and then used that to actually test for convergent evolution in living toothed whale species. So in order to do this, what we could have done was we could have sort of picked groups that we might have assumed from the outset would have evolved convergently. We could have, say, for example, picked all the river dolphins and tried to test if they were convergent. We could have tested, I don't know, say the oceanic dolphins, see if they were convergent. But what we preferred to do was just basically lay all the data down and use a method where it doesn't actually take in any a priori assumptions about which taxa might be convergent, and actually then let that tell us which groups of species were actually convergent. And this is an approach using the programming language R, and it's a package known as Surface. For those of you who do use comparative methods a bit more, this is essentially it's an evolutionary modeling approach. It's a multi-peak Ornstein-Uhlenbeck model that compares the adaptive peaks of the different species, and those species that have similar adaptive peaks are said to be convergent. So we ran that analysis, and what we found was we had 3 separate convergent regimes, 3 different groups of toothed whales that this analysis thought had evolved convergent cochlear shapes. The first is this purple regime. So this is, you've got the sperm whale at the very bottom of the slide there, and its convergently evolved a similar cochlear shape to nearly every single species of beaked whale, apart from 2 species which have done their own separate thing there. That's that yellow regime, the 2 yellow branches, and that's Cuvier's beaked whale and True's beaked whale. And then the third conversion regime was Dodge porpoise, there in the black and white. It has convergently evolved similar shaped cochlea to the pygmy sperm whale and the dwarf sperm whale, just down at the bottom of the slide there. So we quantified the shape, and then we tested which species are actually convergently evolved. We then wanted to sort of measure how strong that convergence is, and actually whether or not it's statistically significant. Of course, people doing these sort of studies, we always like to put like a number on it. We just try and get a nice p number or p value, and that's exactly what we did. So we used a set of previously described metrics known as C metrics or convergence metrics, as you might guess. And this essentially it calculates the shape of the ancestral species on your family tree of, in this case, of toothed whales, and then plots your modern species that you have, and then measures whether or not the ancestral, or the modern forms are closer in space to the ancestral forms. And if they have actually moved closer in that, so for example, this trait space on the slide, then they're said to be strongly convergent, and then it extracts a p-value from that. And what we found from running these C metrics was that the first 2 conversion regimes, so the purple regime and the yellow regime, were statistically significant, but that third regime, the green one, was not. So we discarded that from any further analysis. What we did next then, once we had sort of determined which species were convergent and which ones were statistically significant, we then wanted to look at drivers of this convergent evolution. So what we did was we collected a bunch of data from a range of ecological factors, so what habitat these animals were living in, what they're feeding on, how they're feeding on it, how deep they're diving, and we ran a series of chi-squared tests that allow us to test for significant association between one of these convergent regimes and any of these ecological factors. And what we found from the results of that was that the first convergent regime, the beaked whale and sperm whale convergent regime, has a significant association with living in oceanic habitats and also diving to extreme depths as well. So just sort of to wrap up then, just to take a step back, we've got our convergent regime, we've tested the significance, we've found potential ecological factors that could be driving this evolution. We want to sort of then take a step back and say, well, what do we know about the inner ear of these animals, and what do we know about how these animals live? What is the ecology of these animals? Does this all make sense? Should we be surprised that beaked whales and sperm whales actually have convergently evolved similar shaped inner ears? And sort of spoiler alert, no, there's no issues. This does make perfect sense. So just looking first of all at the anatomy, and then I'll look at the ecology in the next slide. There is a feature that is present in sperm whale inner ears and beaked whale inner ears known as the tympanal recess. If you look at the cochlea model at the bottom of the slide on the right hand side there, it's where the green arrow is pointing, and this feature is known as the tympanal recess, and it's this massive inflation of the scala tympani that we do not see in any other toothed whale groups apart from sperm whales and beaked whales. So potentially this is something that is a factor in their convergent evolution. However, when we broaden the sample a little bit and look at baleen whales and also fossil cetaceans, a few species of those also have this feature too. So in terms of the actual function of this feature, we still don't know. We still need to do more research and figure out what's going on. But there is anatomical similarities between these two groups to the exclusion of other taxa in our sample. In terms of other features of the auditory pathway, there's another series of differences, or at least similarities between sperm whales and beaked whales. The middle ear bones are relatively rigid. The tympanoperiodic complex, so that tympanic bulla and the periotic are actually fused together, whereas they're not in other taxa. And that complex is then actually got bony connections to the skull that, again, in other toothed whale species, is just held in place by ligaments. And that's thought to be to do with the acoustic isolation of these ear bones for dealing with these extreme high frequencies that they're hearing. Just lastly, looking at the ecology, the sperm whales and beaked whales, we already established there is this correlation between oceanic habitat and extreme diving ability, and that's essentially, that's what we know sperm whales and beaked whales do best. These animals are absolutely incredible. They live far out in the open ocean. The only time you see them anywhere near the shore is if there's like a deep water trench nearby, or if they're not well and potentially about to strand, you might see them come close to shore. But apart from that, they're usually just out in the middle of the ocean where it's very hard to watch them. They are supreme deep divers. They can go down for more than 2 hours in one single breath of air. One species of beaked whale has actually been recorded at over 3,000 meters depth, so 3 kilometers straight down. And these animals, again, are doing that in a single breath. They're just absolutely incredible. And one thing we noticed when we started trying to dig into what could be explaining this convergent evolution of sperm whale and beaked whale inner ears was that when we actually examined sort of the physical properties of water itself, we realized that these extreme depths actually are potentially contributing to that shape of the inner ear, because sound velocity, as you likely all well aware, decreases with a decrease in temperature. And that's what happens, obviously, the deeper you go in the water column. And that pattern stays true until you reach about 1,000 meters in depth, where the pressure becomes so much and the water becomes compressed enough that this velocity of sound from that depth onwards, as you go deeper and deeper, this velocity of sound actually starts increasing again. And we suspect that because only sperm whales and beaked whales are actually going deeper than 1,000 meters on a regular basis, it is these animals that need this particular shape of cochlea for hearing at these extreme depths. So to conclude, the deep ocean constrains the phenotype in many different ways, but what we're seeing here is it's actually extending that to internal morphology, the morphology of the inner ear. And of course, I mean, the deep environment is an extreme environment, but it's also an extreme acoustic environment. There's very strong constrictions on how sound travels and how you can deal with that. And if you want to be able to echolocate and communicate at those extreme depths, you need a certain shape of cochlea. And this is what's led to this convergent evolution in these two very evolutionary distinct lineages of toothed whales. And I'd just like to thank my collaborators and people who've scanned specimens and provided data for me. And also thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Travis. Very nice talk. So are there any questions?
Yes, Jean-Luc is having a question.
Okay.
Yes, this is very, very, very interesting. Now, I have a question about the middle ear. Why they keep the middle ear with ossicle to have hair conduction? I mean, do they use a lot air conduction? That's my first question. And the second question is the fact they keep the middle ear obliged to have another to have a mechanism to prevent pressure. So they have dilatation of the artery to close the middle ear to prevent any pain and whatever. So for me, it's it's really strange. They keep this middle ear, which could be more a problem than a benefit. What is your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it needs to have sort of special measures in place to be able to operate like it would if it was a terrestrial mammal, and they do have that. They have a really extensively developed sinus system surrounding the middle ear region. So lots of sort of very highly vascularized sort of tissues in and around there that when they do dive really deep, they fill with blood and engorge that and isolate that region acoustically, so that it's protected from any sort of sounds that come in through bone conduction or some other way. It's actually isolated from that. But in terms of the actual middle ear bones, yeah, I mean they're a little bit different, but I mean they're still operating on the same principles. But they seem to get away with that by isolating it acoustically from the rest of the body when they're using it.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a naive question again. I wanted to know, why do the whales go that deep to feed themselves? What for? I mean, which kind of food they find that deep?
So the majority of food that sperm whales and beaked whales would be feeding on would be squid, and a lot of them, would come sort of migrate up and down during sort of the day. But there's some of the sort of most abundant species are found very deep, and they seem to have sort of tapped into this supply quite a long time ago, because both of these groups are some of the oldest in terms of their evolutionary lineage. They're the longest surviving lineages of the modern species of toothed whales. So it seems to be that they might have initially started feeding on squid that were coming up to the surface, and then as they've become more and more adapted for deep diving, they're tapping into all these different species of squid and some species of fish too, but mainly squid that they're feeding on at those depths. So that seems to be what's driving them to do these extreme dives.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I ask you a question, naive too. But first of all, currently there is an increasing noise in the sea, and we'll see that in the next talk. So what kind of changes or evolution do you anticipate where this growing multiple sources of noise might hide the sound that comes out from these animals, or that go inside them, and that helps them to locate them? So what kind of evolution do you anticipate if they cannot hear themselves anymore?
Well, I think, they're already being, quite badly affected by this, both baleen whales and toothed whales. So, for example, baleen whales are thought to used to be previously capable of communicating over hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, using these low frequency sounds, these songs, and we're actually able to communicate over massive distances. But of course, this anthropogenic noise that we have now in the oceans has really drastically reduced how, like, the maximum distance that these animals are able to communicate between. So in terms of their cultural evolution, how they're communicating between groups is probably been drastically changed over the last couple of centuries. And then you have animals like the beaked whales that I was talking about seem to be particularly susceptible to sounds that are sort of like geological, like seismic charges, stuff like that. There's been cases where these animals have been stranded on a beach, and the autopsies have shown that their hearing anatomy has been damaged. So they've actually had damaged hearing at depth. They've had these really loud noises essentially damage their hearing, and then they've tried to surface too quickly, and then essentially got the bends. They've been damaged from trying to rise to the surface far too quickly. So in terms of actually how they're going to adapt to that, they might start using slightly different frequencies to communicate. We've already seen that with, I think it was baleen whales in sort of in and around the New York area during 9/11. Sort of for those first few days after 9/11, the whales in the region actually shifted back to what we think was the original communication frequencies they were using, because there was in that area for a few days, and they actually started communicating at a different frequency than they had been when there was shipping traffic. So that sort of shift could be seen in multiple species, I guess, over longer time periods as well.
Okay, very interesting. Another short question?
Anne?
Yes. So thanks for this great talk.
Thank you.
So I had a methodological question. So in your analysis, you say you are using some morphological variable to do this convergent evolution analysis. So do you use the landmark coordinates directly or the principal components? And because I'm asking this question because with the cochlea, as there is this coiling, sometimes the principal component analysis gets weird stuff, and this artifact might blur your analysis.
Mm-hmm. So I am using principal components, and that's primarily because that package surface that we were using to determine the conversion regimes, it really does not like highly multidimensional data. So it only really recommends that you use your sort of first two principal components when you're looking to actually analyze that based on the assumptions of that package. So we would like to use, I mean, ideally you would use just the raw coordinates, but of course, you know, that increases the dimensionality so much, and the amount of computational power and time you need to run those analyses increase dramatically. And of course, then I guess the methods just aren't really there yet to handle a lot, at least in terms of looking at conversion evolution. I know there's some better multivariate stuff like by Julian Clavel and stuff are getting better and better at using these things, but for conversion evolution, not yet.